like this, behaves like this, prays like this, fasts like this, and so on and so forth. So in essence, they tell you what a moderate person should be like, and they give you a universal description of what that moderate Muslim is. That's a bit problematic, because if I were to stand up here today and tell you that for you to be a moderate Muslim, you must do X, Y, Z, that is actually a form of extremism, because I am insisting that there is only one way, only one definition for how you can be a moderate Muslim. And if you're not that, then somehow you have gotten out of that, or if you're diverged. So I'm imposing that on you, I'm forcing that on you, and I'm insisting that you have to stick to that description. And that is not actually the message of Islam, and that is not actually the understanding of what moderation is. Moderation is not one type of personality. Moderation is a spectrum based on understanding certain principles of Islam. Now, the one thing that we have to make very clear from the beginning is that there's a difference between the word moderation and the word modernization. And those are two very different concepts that are often confused for each other. So today we have Muslims living here in the West, and we struggle, of course, we have our own struggles. We see in the news the Islamophobia, all of the things happening against Muslims and being said in the Muslims, whether in the National Post or on CBC or on the Globe and Mail. Sometimes we see a few nice articles that say some positive thing about Islam, but the articles that are getting the most Facebook likes and the most comments and the most emails and the most attention are the ones that are always putting Islam in this negative light. To the point that so many of us Muslims not only feel that we are alien in this society, no, we actually feel that being part of this society is in direct conflict with being a Muslim. That it is no longer possible to be a good, conscious Muslim and at the same time a contributing, dynamic member of this Canadian society. So we have this kind of identity war within us. What some of us have done is we have basically adopted aspects of Canadian culture and fused them with Islam and gave them this robe of Islam, even if those things have no relationship to Islam whatsoever. And this became what we understood to be moderation, which in fact is very different. You see, when you live in a society that has certain cultures, certain norms, certain principles, you have to understand that every single thing that we do in society has to ultimately come down to a reference, has to come down to something that we base it on. Now, we do live in a society where there are many things that are wonderful. Going green, for example, and this emphasis on, reducing your carbon footprint, not wasting, not littering, things that, unfortunately, in Muslim majority countries, we don't see. I just read last week that almost 3,000 people in Qatar had to be hospitalized because they ate so much during Eid that they actually filled up emergency rooms more than any other time during the year. And this is a form of excess, this is a form of extremism, this is an embarrassing, scandalizing example of what it is not to be following the Sunnah and the path of the Prophet ﷺ. But then we have this issue going back again to this notion of modernization, that for me to be a good Muslim, for me to be accepted in society, I have to just take all of these things and I have to accept them and I have to give them an Islamic baggage. I have to give them an Islamic justification, even when no justification can be found. So today, for example, and again, I'm going to keep referring to actual events that have happened in our society, and in fact, within just a 6-hour drive of where we live. So just about a month ago, in the beginning of October, there was an article that exploded throughout the Toronto Star about this sister in the community who decided that she wanted to take off the hijab. And taking off the hijab is her decision. Nobody can force her to put on the hijab because this is an act of worship for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this was her choice. Now she decided she wants to go to one of the top national newspapers and explain why she took off the hijab. And one of the explanations she gave was that there is no mention of the hijab in the Quran. It is not a fard, it's not mandatory, right? And we're starting to hear this logic repeated more and more and more. That when you struggle with a certain modern concept, people at work look at you, you're wearing a hijab. They look at you, why are you covering your head like that? I understand in the winter women wear scarves, but it's kind of 35 degrees Celsius outside, and there's no need for you to do so. Why are you doing that? When sisters or members of our community sometimes don't, first first of all, never had a very solid foundation or understanding of what that hijab represented to begin with, they sometimes have a huge conflict and debate when it comes to addressing others. So when someone asks you this question, if you just wore the hijab because when you were young your dad told you to and forced you to in some unfortunate cases, and later on there was no description or explanation or justification or beautification of the concept of hijab, it's just one of those things that you do, then when your coworker asks you this question, you feel embarrassed that you don't have an answer. And when you don't have an answer, you feel that there probably isn't one. So you start inventing explanations to rid yourself of an Islamic practice, explanations that have no basis in the Quran. Because if we're going to follow the logic of it's not explicitly mentioned in the Quran, then we shouldn't be praying 5 times a day. Because that's not mentioned in the Quran. In fact, not even one of the prayers in the Quran is mentioned by name. The only one prayer that is alluded to, حَافِظُوا عَلَى الصَّلَوَاتِ وَالصَّلَاةِ الْوُسْطَى وَقُومُوا لِلَّهِ قَانِتِينَ. Take care of your prayers, and particularly the middle prayer, and rise in remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? But there is no explicit mention that there's these many furud, and this is the sunnah, and so on and so forth. So a lot of us, unfortunately, because we're struggling to fit into the society, which is in and of itself sad, because we shouldn't feel the need to fit in. We already are part of the society. But because we feel that we do need to fit in, we try to constantly explain ourselves. And when we can't come up with a good explanation, we just compromise on our faith altogether. Because why? We just need to please our society. But what I'm trying to argue is there's a very easy way to contribute to your society, to please members of your society to a certain extent, and to be a practicing Muslim. And the reason why I say a certain extent, my dear brothers and sisters, is because no matter how moderate, how nice, how courteous, how respectful, how polite you are in your discussion, how invitive you are to your friends, how good you are to your neighbors, how generous you are with all those who are around you, there are still things about you in the end of the day that some people just don't agree with, and they are too ignorant to want to tolerate. So you can't possibly try to fit everybody in. And as the famous saying goes, I can't tell you the definition of success, but I can tell you the definition of failure. Try to please everyone. And that's exactly the predicament that many Muslims in our society find themselves in. You're trying to please everyone all at once. And then after you've sold away part of your practices here, you've given up this there, you've compromised this here, and so on and so forth. After you've done everything to accommodate and please and compromise and make others like you and accept you, you're still unaccepted. And you still have a lot of people who are not accepting you. And you're always going to have that issue. So my dear brothers and sisters, this is one concept we have to understand very clearly. And the concept is very simple. And it was very eloquently put by a famous English philosopher. If you want to avoid criticism, say nothing, do nothing, and be nothing. And that's the reality that we have to live as Muslims. We have to have the strength and the courtesy and understanding to be able to defend our opinions, which nicely brings us back again to the concept of moderation. So we've discussed the fact that I can't and I won't and I should not, and it would be wrong of me and extreme of me to tell you what you should do to be a moderate Muslim. Because there are certain, depending on the context, depending on the society, what is moderate in certain places may not be in certain others, and vice versa. Now, there are certain concepts in Islam and certain practices and certain teachings that are universals. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us very clearly in Surah Al-Imran, هو الذي أنزل عليكم الكتاب فيه آيات محكمات هن أم الكتاب وأخر متشابهات. He is the one, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who has revealed unto you the book, within which there are certain verses that are absolute, that are not subject to interpretation. They can't possibly have more than one meaning. For example, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. There's just no other way to interpret or understand that than to mean there is only one definitive, partnerless deity, and that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But there are other verses in the Quran that are called mutashabihat. And tashabuh comes from having resemblance or similarity. In other words, there's a certain vagueness, there's a certain room for interpretation that is possible for those verses. The difference, however, is that those who interpret those verses have to be individuals who are qualified, have to be individuals who have an understanding and a deep knowledge of the texts through which they can extract information. Most of us sitting in the room, and there's a reason why questions in the beginning, simply do not have the qualification to just start making fatwas about what is and isn't halal and haram in Islam. And frankly, most of us shouldn't be in this business because we simply do not have what it takes to be able to do so. That doesn't mean you should shut off your mind and only follow what someone tells you blindly. No. It means you should critically think, you should critically appraise, you should learn and teach yourself, and most importantly, you should open your eyes and your mind to the different opinions that scholars, respected scholars throughout history have had, so you can learn from their interactions together. The reason why I'm saying this, my dear brothers and sisters, is because in our community, and as human beings altogether, we have a tendency to just like to be in a comfort zone. Right? We just like to have the same kind of friends, the same kind of ideas, watch the same kinds of movies, go out with the same kinds of people, say the same kinds of jokes. We just have our own niche, our own mindset, our own stereotype, and we enjoy it, and it gives us meaning. And the problem is when you come across people who are very different from you. And that's why as a community we end up falling into this whole business of classifying others. So to give you a very simple example, I'm sure most of us here have this system in our mind where whenever you find out that there's a brother or a sister that belongs to and frequently goes to a certain masjid, that means something. And if they listen to certain speakers, that means something. And if they read certain books, that means something. And you fit them into these neat categories where they are already given a definition in your head. So instead of getting to know this brother, you just saw one action from him. He just told you that he enjoys listening to a certain speaker, for example. And let's say you know that that certain speaker is someone who you disagree with on certain terms. Now you automatically assume that this brother is exactly like that speaker. His opinions are a direct carbon copy of that speaker, and it's someone you should have no business dealing with whatsoever. Unfortunately, we've seen this happen throughout our community for the past 40 years, where you would see, for example, a masjid committee getting together, and organizers getting together, trying to determine, how the masjid should operate and how you can create activities and things for the youth and so on. And then a few people would disagree with each other. And instead of sitting together and trying to work out these disagreements, it leads to very sour conflict between them. And then they end up separating and branching off and creating their own institutions and their own masjids. And then you end up with this rivalry, where you are part of this masjid, or are you part of that masjid? And if you're part of this masjid, that means something. And if you're part of that masjid, it means something else. I remember when I first came to Canada, I went to pray at this masjid, which, later on I came to learn was considered controversial in some places. I, of course, had no idea. This was my neighborhood. This is the only masjid. It's time to pray Asr. And I remember praying, and I remember after I prayed, a brother came up to me and literally screamed at me. And he said to me that, how could you possibly be praying here? I said, well, what are you doing here yourself? Right? And he said that he's here to give da'wah, he's here to, clear up conceptions and so on and so forth. Now, my point here is that he had some truth in what he said. He is right. A lot of the opinions that are mentioned in this masjid are controversial. And no, I don't want to affiliate myself with the thinking of the people who represent this masjid. That's for sure. But at the same time, there is a certain methodology to da'wah and a certain methodology to bringing things to people's attention, and a certain methodology through which we can create understanding between us and create a common denominator. Because my dear brothers and sisters, when you see in the media an attack against Muslims, you never hear the fine distinctions between the different types of Sunni Islam. You just hear Muslims did this. All of us are put in the same bracket. So instead of focusing on the common denominator that brings us together, which is vast and much, we focus on the very few, relatively small and trivial things that divide us together, because that's ultimately what we prefer. We prefer to have our inward mentality, our own little niche, and that's where we're comfortable. And this problem is made more difficult when we misunderstand certain ahadith and certain texts from the Quran. So for example, we are all familiar with the hadith that says, إن الإسلام بدأ غريبا وسيعود غريبا كما بدأ فطوبى للغرباء. Islam began strange, and it will return to be a strange religion, as it were in the beginning. So glad tidings be to those who are strange. Now, some brothers and sisters in our community interpret this to mean I have to always be a weirdo and isolated, because the more I am strange, the more I am weird, the more I am isolated, the more people don't like me. That is a prophecy that I am amongst those who are righteous and amongst those who are struggling. And what makes this problem worse is that when you try to argue with the brothers or sisters to explain to them that this is wrong, they actually look at what you're saying as even more validation. Yes, even the Muslim community is ostracizing me. SubhanAllah, I'm part of this fi'ah al-mansura. You know, this is a prophecy coming true. There's only a few people like me who are still... And this is of course not true. But it is a very dangerous position to be in, because you completely at this point seal yourself to any form of criticism. You seal yourself to any form of being challenged for some of your views. We see other hadith by the Prophet ﷺ, and these are authentic hadith, but the meanings of them are misunderstood. The Prophet ﷺ never said, Islam began isolated and it will return isolated. So glad tidings to those who consistently isolate themselves. We saw in the beginning of the message spread in Arabia, of course the Prophet and his Sahaba were isolated. But then quickly within the Prophet ﷺ's lifetime, it was no longer isolated at all. It was the dominant religion of the entire peninsula. And even the next 3 generations after the Prophet, it continued to be the dominant religion, i.e. not isolated throughout the peninsula. Now, who are you and I to say that these Sahaba and these righteous companions and Tabi'een, who were not in a situation where Islam was strange or isolated, are somehow now no longer part of that equation? We cannot, and we cannot say that without denigrating from their reward with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So these hadith need to be understood in a certain context. And again, this is where qualification and scholarship is necessary in order to put these hadith into context. Sahih hadith, you don't also want to get into the business of just because a certain hadith says something that, you know, it's a little difficult, it's a little thick on the ears, you know, maybe it's not super, you know, appropriate for, you throw it out with the bathwater and say, oh yeah, this hadith is not acceptable, I don't take it. This is not your business. Again, you're not a muhaddith. You don't know the rigorous methodology by which a hadith are classified, and the matn and the isnad. It's so rigorous to the point that if it were to be proven that one single member of a chain or chain of narrators had a single time in their lives where they said, not just said a lie, but even performed something that is pseudo-deceptive, that is just a little bit deceptive, this hadith was completely eliminated and given an automatic weak designation. The matn, for example, sometimes the isnad of the hadith is very solid and very strong. But when you actually read the hadith itself, it includes a detail that cannot possibly have happened. So for example, imagine if there's a hadith by one sahabi that talks about, you know, the existence of a plant that actually did not ever exist in Medina. That hadith automatically would be suspect and would be suspicious of fabrication, because although the isnad, although the matn, although the chain of narrators is solid, the content of the hadith itself is questionable, and that casts a serious doubt and a serious light on whether this hadith is authentic or not. Now, there are 3 things that do affect how our moderation as Muslims is influenced. The first is our individual stamina. And this is a very key point that I really want all of the brothers and sisters here to be very careful about, because it's when you confuse your stamina against someone else that you may mistakenly consider someone else extreme just because they have more ability or more patience or more willingness to struggle in the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than you, right? So for example, we have seen amongst even the Anbiya, even amongst the prophets themselves, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to us that amongst them, مِنْهُمْ مَنْ قَصَصْنَا عَلَيْكَ وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ لَمْ نَقْصُصْ عَلَيْكَ. Amongst them are some prophets that we know their stories extensively, and some who we don't even know their names. But we do know about Prophet Nuh alayhi salam, who, to wrap it up in one sentence, spent 950 years of his life calling people to the message of Islam, never once giving up or losing patience, to only have a number less than 100, maybe 80 people who ended up accepting his message, was constantly ridiculed and mocked and put in positions of extreme humiliation, and he still persevered for the sake of Allah. That is a mountain of patience that not every single human being has. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah Al-Baqarah, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not burden a soul with more than it can bear. There are brothers and sisters in this room who have an infinite capacity, to pray, not just do the bare minimum, which is to pray 5 times a day and fast the month of Ramadan. No, they fast Mondays and Thursdays. They fast the 3 white nights of the month. They make sure that they pray the sunnah and the nawafil, and they wake up in the middle of the night to do qiyam. They do the khitmah of the Quran twice a month. On top of all that, they are still excelling at school somehow and doing very well with their community and still involved in the community, teaching Islam and learning Quran and learning Arabic and so on and so forth. There are some brothers and sisters who have this. And this is a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that does not make them extreme. And then there are brothers and sisters in our community who just want to do the bare minimum. They want to just pray 5 times a day after they have said the shahada. They want to just fast the month of Ramadan, give zakah if they can, and if possible and feasible financially and physically, to do hajj once in their lives. And that's it. And in fact, we've seen this before. A Bedouin man comes up to the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and he says to him, Ya Muhammad, tell me about Islam. And the Prophet ﷺ tell me how I can embrace Islam and what it requires to be a Muslim. And the Prophet ﷺ says to him the 5 different pillars of Islam. He says to him, O Muhammad, you're telling me that as a Muslim I should do this, shahada, salah, zakah, sawm, hajj, that these are the 5 things I need to do to be a Muslim and a practicing Muslim. The Prophet ﷺ said yes. He said, I swear by Allah, I will do only these things and nothing more. And he walked away. He didn't even wait for the Prophet ﷺ to give him a response, to react. He just walked away. And the Messenger ﷺ looked at his companions and he smiled. And he said to them, if he is truthful in what he just said, he is going to Jannah. This sets the stage for the bare minimum requirements of being a moderate Muslim. Someone who fulfills the 5 basic pillars of Islam. That's the most basic type. But then there is the going above and beyond the call of duty, moderate Muslim, who still within the Quran and within the Sunnah and with using evidence from hadith and so on and so forth, still does things that are aligned with the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ. The mistake we fall into is when we start seeing a brother become more practicing, we automatically say, stop being so extreme, stop being so radical, stop being too fundamentalist, have some fun, lighten up, whatever the case may be. As though these people have, the minute they decided to come closer to Allah, decided to also divorce fun and laughing and all of that, right? As though they are incapable of living normal, happy lives while still trying to come closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through their actions and deeds. And this is a mistake and a trap we constantly fall into. When someone doesn't fit our definition of moderate, because that's what we want to be, they're automatically extreme. Which is another issue. Have you ever met someone who said to you, you know what, I think I am extreme. I think I'm an extremist actually. Have you ever met someone who said that? Of course not. Even the extremist thinks he or she is moderate, right? The only thing people are willing to say, maybe, is that maybe I'm a little bit liberal, you know, I'm a little bit open-minded, but nobody will ever say I'm an extremist. Why? Because extremism is a bad thing and nobody wants to think that they are like that, even if they actually are, right? And that's a concern and a problem that we have to, as Muslims, be very, very careful about. We have to constantly keep in check exactly our actions and what we do as Muslims to understand, what are we doing? Is this aligned with the Sunnah? Is this aligned with the teachings of the Quran? The problem with extremism, or what really constitutes extremism, is something very simple. When you insist that the only way to be a Muslim and to be a good Muslim and to be an acceptable Muslim is to be a you kind of Muslim. Is for someone to just be exactly like you and to follow exactly the way you think and to follow exactly what you accept. That is the only acceptable position. Everything else is unacceptable. Everything else has the potential to be misguided and has the potential. So this commits 2 problems at once. Number 1, you assume that you are on the right path, which you can never confer, which you can never be sure of. There is a reason why 17 times a day you stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and say, Ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim, guide us to the straight path. You're not saying, you know, Qina ala as-sirat al-mustaqim. You're not saying, maintain us on the straight path on which we already are. You're saying, guide us to the straight path. As though between prayer to prayer, even within a 2-hour span sometimes, it could have been possible that events would have happened that caused you to diverge from the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In fact, as though between rak'ah to rak'ah, from coming up from sujood to saying Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, and again asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide you, an event could have happened, and waswasa could have came to you that made you have a thought or have an instinct that made you diverge from the right path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You and I are in a constant struggle for the rest of our lives, and until we die, wanting and craving and wishing to be amongst those who are guided on the straight path. Anybody who claims that they are on the right path and that